In the darkness before memory, before words carried weight across generations, before stone held carving or clay held mark, there was night, absolute, unbroken except by distant stars and the cold, indifferent moon. The world belonged to darkness, then belonged to the creatures whose eyes caught moonlight and reflected it back, whose claws found purchase in shadow, whose teeth knew no hesitation. Humans were small then, were vulnerable, were prey as often as predator. The night pressed against skin with physical weight, and the hours between sunset and sunrise were hours of waiting, of huddling together for warmth, of hoping to survive until light returned. But somewhere in that ancient darkness, a flame was born that would not die, not the first flame. Lightning had painted the sky with fire since Earth's beginning, since atmosphere learned to hold charge and release it in brilliant, violent arcs that struck trees and grasslands and set the world temporarily ablaze. Volcanoes had breathed burning rivers across stone, had shown that earth itself held fire within, that mountains could open and pour forth light and heat and destruction. Fire was known. Fire was witnessed. Fire was feared and perhaps dimly understood as something powerful, something divine, something that belonged to forces beyond human control. But this fire was different. This was the fire that stayed when storms passed, that waited when humans needed it, that followed from camp to camp, carried in cupped hands and hollow reeds, protected against wind and rain with the desperation of those who understood what they carried. This was fire made companion, fire made tool, fire transformed from wild elemental force into something that answered, however incompletely, to human will. We do not know the first keeper's name. History offers no face, no voice, no single moment when flame moved from wild thing to tamed companion. The archaeological record shows evidence of controlled fire stretching back perhaps 1,000,000 years, charred bones and earth, patterns of burning that suggest intention rather than accident. But evidence of fire and understanding of fire are different things. A lightning-struck tree might burn for days. Humans might gather around that gift of accidental warmth, might carry embers from it when they moved, might learn gradually that feeding certain materials to flame kept it breathing. The transition was gradual, was generational, was knowledge accumulated through countless experiments, through failures that left camps cold and vulnerable, through successes that were remembered and repeated and refined. Somewhere perhaps in the great Rift Valley of Africa, beneath volcanic peaks that still breathed smoke, perhaps in a cave mouth overlooking waters that would later be called Mediterranean, perhaps in dozens of places simultaneously as different human groups discovered and rediscovered the same essential knowledge. Someone learned to feed the flame, to keep it breathing through the night, to make it answer. The knowledge was sacred then, though we have no word for how it was understood. Sacred because fire meant survival. Sacred because maintaining fire required attention, required dedication, required continuous feeding and tending and protecting. Sacred because fire was the thing that separated human camps from the surrounding darkness, that created sphere of light and warmth in world that offered neither. The first firekeepers were perhaps the first priests, the first holders of knowledge that transcended immediate survival needs, the first who understood that some tasks were too important to be left to chance or individual initiative. And the knowledge spread like warmth itself, moving through kinship groups and across territories, carried by those who migrated, shared with those who offered hospitality, traded for other precious knowledge or tools or access to hunting grounds. The spreading was not swift by modern measure, might take generations for fire-tending techniques to move from one valley to the next, from one coast to distant interior. But the spreading was inevitable. Fire was too valuable. Fire changed too much. Fire could not be known by some and ignored by others without creating imbalance that survival would eventually correct. Fire transformed eating, transformed nourishment. Cooking was not luxury but revolution. Roots and tubers that were toxic when raw became digestible when heated. Meat that harbored parasites and spoiled quickly could be rendered safe and preserved. The tough fibers that defined plant foods softened under flame's attention. Nutrition improved. Calories became more available. And brains, those costly organs that consume so much energy, could grow larger, could become more complex, could begin the long development toward consciousness that recognizes itself, toward thought that reflects on thinking, toward the capacity to imagine what is not present, to plan for distant futures, to create symbol and meaning and story. Fire transformed the night. Predators, the great cats with their reflective eyes, the hyenas with their crushing jaws, the wolves that hunted in coordinated packs retreated from the circle of light, learned to associate flame with danger, with pain, with territory that belonged to the small, upright creatures who carried the burning thing. The darkness that had owned every hour between sunset and sunrise surrendered its dominion, not completely, not without resistance, but enough. Enough that humans could gather after dark, could continue working, could extend their useful hours beyond what sun dictated. And in those extended hours around those carefully tended flames, as darkness pressed close and stars turned slowly overhead, something else was born. Stories. We cannot know the first story told around fire, cannot know whether it was recounting of day's hunt, or explanation of thunder's origin, or cautionary tale about dangers that lurked beyond the light. But fire created audience, created gathering place, created duration hours of darkness that were no longer simply endured, but could be filled with voice and gesture, and the emerging magic of narrative. Some scholars suggest that fire created human language itself, that the complicated coordination required for fire tending, and the social bonds strengthened by gathering around flames selected for individuals who could communicate more effectively, who could share knowledge through increasingly sophisticated sounds and symbols. Songs emerged, rhythms that matched heartbeat or footfall or the eternal rhythm of breath. Melodies that carried meaning before words could fully capture it. The first music was perhaps percussion hands clapping, stones struck together, sticks beating against hollow logs. But voice came too. Voice that could hold a note, that could weave patterns in air, that could create beauty that served no immediate survival purpose but served something else, something that had no name yet but would later be called art, culture, the human spirit expressing itself. Fire transformed time, made winter bearable those long dark months when game was scarce, and cold penetrated everything could be survived huddled near flames, could become time of storytelling and tool-making, and the formation of social bonds that would carry through to spring. Made night usable hours that had been lost to darkness became hours of community, of teaching, of the transmission of knowledge from old to young. Made the impossible seem possible if fire could be tamed, if flame could be made to serve. Then perhaps other wild things could be understood and controlled and incorporated into human life. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary. Hearths and charcoal scatters, burned animal bones bearing cut marks that suggest butchering before cooking, heat-treated stones that were deliberately placed in fire to improve their flaking properties for tool making. The evidence is real, but is also insufficient, cannot tell us what it meant to the first firekeepers, cannot convey the wonder, the fear, the reverence with which flame was regarded, cannot capture the moment when someone first realized that fire could be carried, could be maintained, could be prevented from dying if proper attention was given. Perhaps it was never a single moment. Perhaps it was slow accumulation of understanding, generation after generation learning that certain dry materials caught more easily, that wind could kill flame or feed it depending on shelter and placement, that ember could be preserved through night if buried in ash, that flame could be transported if carried in pottery or horn or hollow bone. The knowledge accumulated, the techniques refined, the sacred trust of firekeeping passed from elder to young, from experienced to novice, through centuries that left no written record but left evidence burned into earth itself. The first fire that would not die, the flame that waded through storms and migrations and the long millennia of human becoming, the warmth that changed everything, changed diet and brain size and social organization and language and art, and the very texture of human consciousness. We carry that fire still. Carry it in our bodies that evolved around flame's warmth, in our eyes that adapted to firelight, in our food that we still prefer cooked, in our stories that we still tell gathering together as darkness falls. Forever carried, forever tended, forever the boundary between before and after, between the humans who huddled in darkness and the humans who commanded light, between the world as it was given and the world as it was transformed through understanding, through will, through the sacred trust of keeping alive the fire that refused to die. The flame burned still. In every hearth and candle, in every controlled burn and managed flame, in the eternal fire that some temples maintain, never letting it extinguish across years and decades and centuries, burns in memory, burns in symbol, burns in the knowledge that we are the inheritors of that first keeping, that first trust, that first transformation, the fire that stayed, the flame that waited, the light that refused to surrender to the surrounding dark. In the quiet before civilization, when humans were still becoming what they would be, someone looked upward, looked beyond the immediate concerns of food and shelter and survival, looked past the horizon that bounded daily life, looked up into the vast darkness scattered with points of light that had witnessed every human moment since humans existed, and saw not chaos but pattern. The recognition changed everything, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly across generations. The understanding grew that the lights in the sky moved according to rules, that certain stars rose at certain seasons, that the moon followed predictable phases, that the sun's path across the sky varied through the year in ways that could be measured, anticipated, used. The sky became calendar, became guide, became the first book that humans learned to read, and then they began to write back. The stone circles started appearing across landscapes that would later bear 1,000 different names. Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey, massive T-shaped pillars carved with animals and symbols, arranged in circles, built by people who supposedly had not yet discovered agriculture, had not yet settled into permanent villages, had not yet developed the social organization that monument building was thought to require. The stones stand 11,000 years old, older than Stonehenge by 6 millennia, older than the Egyptian pyramids by 7, challenging every assumption about when civilization began and what forms it took. Nabta Playa in Egypt's Nubian desert stone circles aligned to the summer solstice, constructed 7,000 years ago by cattle-herding peoples who lived beside a lake that has long since vanished into sand. The alignments were precise, were intentional, were maintained across centuries as the stones were moved and repositioned to track celestial movements that themselves changed slowly across millennia as Earth's axis wobbled in its long procession. Stonehenge itself, the most famous, though not the oldest or largest of the megalithic monuments standing on Salisbury Plain where wind moves constantly across grass, and the horizon stretches unbroken in all directions. The sarsen stones, each weighing 25 tons, transported from quarries 20 miles distant. The bluestones, smaller but still massive, brought from Wales across distances that required either epic overland journeys or coastal voyaging. The monument built in stages across 1,500 years, each generation adding to or modifying what previous generations had created, maintaining purpose that transcended individual lifetimes. We stand among these stones now, those of us fortunate enough to visit them and feel their weight. Not just physical weight, though that is impressive enough, but the weight of intention, the weight of effort, the weight of meaning that we can only partially reconstruct. The stones are silent about their purposes. The cultures that raised them left no written records. We have only the stones themselves and the alignments, and the knowledge that people invested generations of labor in creating these monuments to sky patterns. The orthodox explanations speak of astronomical observation, of tracking solstices and equinoxes, of predicting seasons for agricultural planning, of creating calendars that allowed coordination of planting and harvest. These explanations are true as far as they go. The alignments are real. The astronomical precision is undeniable. These monuments functioned as observatories, as calendars, as tools for measuring time's passage through celestial markers. but standing among the stones feeling wind that has blown across these plains for thousands of years, watching light move across megalith faces in patterns their builders calculated, sensing the vast effort required to transport and place these massive blocks, you understand that function alone does not explain devotion, does not explain why people who lived short, difficult lives invested so much in creating permanence, does not explain what compelled them to capture sky patterns in earth-bound monuments that would outlast them by millennia. Perhaps the stones were temples, places of worship where people gathered to mark celestial events, to celebrate solstices, to align themselves with cosmic rhythms that seemed eternal compared to human brevity. Perhaps the monuments were expressions of control, the attempt to pin down the movements of sun and moon and stars, to make predictable what seemed divine, to assert human understanding over forces that had been mysterious since humans learned to wonder. Perhaps the stones were memory, were attempts to preserve knowledge across generations when writing did not exist, when knowledge lived only in human minds and died when those minds died. The stones remembered sky patterns when human memory failed, recorded alignments that took decades to verify, but that, once recorded in stone, would persist through centuries. The megaliths were the first books written in placement and alignment, books that could be read by those who knew how to observe, books that preserved knowledge in the most permanent form available. Or perhaps the stones were something else entirely, were expressions of yearning toward the eternal, were attempts to participate in the cosmic order by reflecting it on earth, were prayers made solid, were the sacred made visible through massive effort and precise calculation, were humanity reaching toward something larger than itself, trying to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, between earth-bound and celestial. We will never know with certainty. The builders left no explanation. The knowledge of how to read the stones in the way they were meant to be read was lost as the cultures that built them dissolved or transformed into other cultures with other priorities. We have learned to measure the alignments, to calculate the astronomical precision, to reconstruct the building methods. But we cannot reconstruct the meaning, cannot know what it felt like to participate in monument building that would take generations, cannot know what was believed about the relationship between earth and sky, between human and divine, between the mortal effort of raising stones and the eternal movements they recorded. The stones stand now in their various locations across the world. Some are famous Stonehenge, and the pyramids and Easter Island's Moai. Some are obscure, known only to archaeologists and local inhabitants. Some have been restored, their fallen stones re-erected, their original configurations guessed at or reconstructed. Some remain as they fell, lying where they toppled centuries or millennia ago, slowly being reclaimed by earth and vegetation. Tourists visit them, photograph them, walk among them following roped pathways that prevent touching, prevent climbing, prevent the kind of intimate contact that might help understanding but that would also, with millions of visitors, destroy what remains. The stones have become heritage sites, cultural landmarks, tourist destinations. They appear in guidebooks and on postcards, and in documentaries that explain their astronomical alignments and speculate about their builders. But sometimes in early morning before crowds arrive, or in evening after they've left, or on days when weather keeps visitors away, the stones still whisper their original purpose, still speak of the impulse to reach beyond the immediate, still testify to humanity's ancient drive to understand the patterns that govern existence, to mark time's passage in permanent ways, to create something that will outlast the creator and carry knowledge forward into futures that cannot be imagined. The stone that remembered sky, the monument that captured celestial patterns in earth-bound permanence, the megalith that made time visible and gave permanence to what seemed eternal. Forever standing, forever marking, forever testimony to humans reaching toward understanding that exceeded their grasp, toward permanence that exceeded their lifespans, toward meaning that exceeded their immediate needs. The stones stand, the alignments hold, and the sky they record continues its eternal movements, indifferent to the monuments that track it, indifferent to the humans who raised stones to capture its patterns, indifferent except that some of those humans across distances of time that dwarf individual lives look upward still and see not chaos but pattern. See not randomness but order. See not meaninglessness but the ancient human drive to understand, to measure, to create monuments to comprehension itself. The stones, forever standing, forever remembering, forever marking the threshold between humans who simply experienced the sky and humans who learned to read it, to predict it, to capture its patterns in stone that would outlast empires. 4 rivers converged in the land between Tigris and Euphrates primarily, but others too, tributaries and channels that wove through landscape in patterns that changed with seasons and centuries. The land was called Mesopotamia, between the rivers, and it was here, in this geography of water and silt, that cities were born, not villages grown large, not temporary gathering places that attracted people during certain seasons and dispersed them again, but permanent settlements of thousands, then tens of thousands, Uruk and and Eridu and Babylon, places where stone architecture reached toward sky, where writing emerged to track grain stores and property claims, where social hierarchy crystallized into forms that would persist for millennia. The rivers made it possible, made it necessary. The floods came annually, unpredictable in their timing and severity, depositing silt rich with nutrients that made agriculture possible, but also destroying everything in their path when they overflowed their banks. The floods could not be ignored, could not be left to individual families or small kinship groups to manage. Required cooperation on scales humanity had never attempted. Irrigation channels dug and maintained, levees constructed and reinforced, water stored during abundance for use during drought, coordination of planting and harvest across territories that stretched beyond what any one person could see or control. The cooperation required organization. The organization required hierarchy. Someone had to direct the digging of channels. Someone had to resolve disputes about water allocation. Someone had to store surplus grain against future shortage. Someone had to maintain records of who contributed what labor, who owned which fields, who owed obligations to whom. The requirements of managing water and agriculture created the first true bureaucracies, the first systems of social organization that transcended kinship bonds. And from those requirements, cities grew. Uruk emerged first, or perhaps was merely first among equals, first to reach the scale that we recognize as urban. By 3000 BCE, Uruk held perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, concentrated in area less than 2 square miles, living in houses that shared walls and pressed close together, working in specializations that freed them from direct agricultural labor, potters and metal workers and priests and scribes and soldiers, and the countless other roles that complex society requires. The city's heart was the temple district, ziggurats rising in stepped layers toward sky, topped with shrines where priests performed rituals that maintained cosmic order, kept gods favorably disposed, ensured that floods would come at appropriate times and in appropriate magnitude. The ziggurats were mountains built by human hands, artificial peaks in flat river valley, reaching toward heaven in landscape that offered no natural heights. They were impressive, were visible from miles away, were statements of collective capability and religious devotion, and the power of organized labor to transform landscape according to human will. But the ziggurats were not the city's true innovation. That innovation lay in the scribal schools attached to the temples, in the administrative buildings where records were kept, in the development of writing. Writing emerged in Mesopotamia not as poetry, but as accounting. As the need to track grain stores and animal counts and land ownership across generations and across larger populations than memory alone could manage. The first writing was pictographic simple images representing objects, a sheep for sheep, a grain stalk for grain. But pictographs have limitations. They can represent concrete things but struggle with abstractions, with verbs and adjectives, and the grammatical relationships that language requires. The breakthrough came with phonetic writing, the realization that symbols could represent sounds rather than things, that those sounds could be combined to represent any word, any concept, any thought that could be spoken. The cuneiform script that developed in Mesopotamia was wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay with reed stylus, creating tablets that, once dried or fired, would preserve their contents across millennia. The tablets recorded everything: inventories and sales, legal contracts and royal proclamations, prayers to gods and complaints about shoddy merchandise, epic poems and wisdom literature and astronomical observations. Writing changed what could be known, changed what could be remembered, changed what could be coordinated across distance and time. A merchant in could send orders to agent in distant city, confident that instructions would be preserved and executed. A king could proclaim laws that would remain consistent across his reign and beyond. A scholar could record observations that would be available to future scholars who never met the original observer. Writing made civilization scalable, made possible the coordination and accumulation of knowledge that define human progress. But the rivers that built the cities also shaped them in darker ways. Warfare became organized. Cities competed for water access, for agricultural land, for control of trade routes. Armies were not temporary gatherings of adult males, but permanent institutions, professional soldiers trained and equipped and deployed according to strategic calculations. Walls surrounded cities, massive mud brick barriers that required enormous labor to construct and maintain, but that offered protection against siege. The walls testified to permanent threat, to the reality that wealth concentrated in cities attracted those who would take it. That success created target that required constant defense. Slavery emerged as institution rather than occasional practice. Prisoners of war became permanent underclass, laboring on irrigation projects and construction works, and in fields their status hereditary, their lack of freedom legally codified and socially accepted. The equality that had characterized smaller human groups where everyone's labor was needed and everyone's contribution mattered disappeared in cities where hierarchy became vast and rigid. The rivers that built cities also created inequality, created suffering, created the dark side of civilization, slavery and warfare, and poverty existing alongside monumental architecture and artistic achievement and intellectual advancement. The Mesopotamian cities were glorious and terrible simultaneously, were places of incredible human creativity and places of incredible human cruelty, were testament to what humans could achieve through cooperation and testament to what humans could do to each other when social bonds stretched beyond personal connection. The cities stand now as archaeological ruins tells, those artificial hills that mark ancient settlements, containing layer upon layer of mud, brick, and pottery, and the compressed remains of thousands of years of human habitation. Archaeologists excavate them carefully, sifting through dirt for tablets and artifacts, reconstructing through fragments what life was like in the first cities, what people thought and believed and created and destroyed. The rivers still flow, Tigris and Euphrates cutting through Iraq, through landscape that has seen empires rise and fall, seen civilizations bloom and collapse, seen the constant human struggle to manage water and harness its power and survive its caprices. The rivers remain, indifferent to human projects, flowing as they have flowed since before cities existed, flowing as they will flow after all cities crumble. But the legacy of those first cities persists in every modern city, persists in writing systems that trace descent from cuneiform, persists in legal codes and bureaucratic systems and social hierarchies that echo Mesopotamian origins, persists in the fundamental patterns of urban life, the concentration of population, the specialization of labor, the coordination through impersonal systems, the storage and distribution of surplus, the organization of collective action on scales that transcend kinship. The river that built the first city, the water that demanded cooperation, the floods that created both abundance and destruction, the geography that forced humans to organize, to coordinate, to create institutions that would persist across generations, forever flowing, forever shaping, forever the boundary between nomadic past and urban future, between small-scale human organization and the complex civilizations that would dominate history. The rivers flow still. The cities are ruins. But the transformation that began between the rivers, the birth of urban civilization, the emergence of writing, the creation of social complexity that defines human history, that transformation continues in every city street, continues in every written word, continues in every moment when humans coordinate their actions through institutions and systems and shared understandings that make possible what individuals alone could never achieve. The river, the city, the beginning of civilization as we know it, forever flowing, forever building, forever the origin point where everything changed. In Egypt's desert, where life and death existed in stark adjacency, the green ribbon of Nile Valley surrendering abruptly to lifeless sand, the pyramids rose as monuments to impossibility's defeat. Not the first pyramids, not the largest in base area, but the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, built around 2560 BCE, perfect in its proportions, astronomical in its alignments, mathematical in its relationships, stood as testament to what humans could achieve when purpose aligned with capability, and when entire civilization bent itself toward single monumental goal. The tomb was more than burial place, was more than simply massive, was attempt to capture eternity in stone. We approach it now as tourists, cameras ready, guidebooks explaining dimensions and dates and construction theories. We see it diminished, stripped of its smooth limestone casing that once made it gleam white in desert sun, topped now with rougher backing stones that give it stepped appearance never intended, surrounded by modern Cairo's sprawl where ancient builders saw only desert and sky. But even diminished, even robbed of its treasures and surrounded by gift shops and camel rides, the pyramid overwhelms, asserts presence, demands recognition. The numbers themselves resist comprehension. 2.3 million stone blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons. Some blocks weigh 15 tons. Some, used in the king's chamber ceiling, weigh 50 tons or more. The blocks were quarried limestone from local sources, granite from Aswan 500 miles up the Nile transported, shaped, positioned with precision that modern builders struggle to match even with steel tools and motorized equipment. The base covers 13 acres and deviates from perfect square by less than 2 inches. The sides align to cardinal directions with error of less than 1/15 of a degree. The ratios embedded in the structure height to base perimeter approximates the ratio of radius to circumference of circle suggest mathematical knowledge that may have been intentional or may be remarkable coincidence. How it was built remains debated. The ramps required to reach upper courses would have been massive themselves, would have consumed more material than pyramid itself if they rose at reasonable angle. Internal ramps are possible but leave little archaeological trace. Some theories invoke cranes and counterweights. Some invoke techniques we haven't imagined. The mystery persists not because ancient builders were impossibly advanced, but because they were differently capable, had access to unlimited labor, had patience that measured projects in decades, had knowledge of techniques that weren't preserved because they were obvious to anyone who built things then, because written explanations weren't needed. What we know is that the pyramid was built. Know that it required perhaps 100,000 workers over 20 years. Know that those workers were not slaves. Recent archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows decent housing, meat-rich diet, medical care for injuries, proper burial for those who died during construction. The workers were likely seasonal laborers, farmers during flood months when fields were inundated, participating in projects that connected them to divine kingship and cosmic order, receiving payment in beer and bread and the intangible benefits of participating in something larger than individual life. The labor was hard, was dangerous. Workers fell, were crushed, died from exhaustion and heat and the thousand risks that massive construction projects entail. But the labor was also sacred. Was participation in ensuring Pharaoh's successful afterlife, which in turn ensured Egypt's continued prosperity, which ensured the floods would come, and the crops would grow and life would continue. The pyramid was not vanity project but religious necessity, was the machine that transformed dead king into eternal being, that housed his body and possessions and provisions for journey through afterlife, that maintained his presence as intermediary between human and divine. Inside, the pyramid contained chambers and passages that led to king's burial chamber, reached through ascending corridor, through grand gallery whose corbelled ceiling rose to 28 feet, through passages deliberately blocked with granite plugs after Pharaoh's burial. The burial chamber itself was modest granite walls, ceiling, floor, containing only sarcophagus that once held king's mummy, everything else stripped away by robbers in ancient times, long before modern archaeology arrived to find empty rooms echoing with absence. But the emptiness is itself eloquent, speaks of the failure of permanence. The pyramid was meant to protect Pharaoh's body for eternity, to ensure that mummy remained intact so soul could return to it, so afterlife could be successfully navigated. Despite massive stone and hidden entrances and blocked passages, robbers found their way in, found and took the treasures, probably took the mummy itself, stripping it of precious amulets and gold. The eternal preservation failed. The body that was supposed to last forever was lost within centuries of burial. Yet the pyramid succeeded in other ways, succeeded in creating permanence of different kind. The structure remains, has remained for 4,500 years, will likely remain for many thousands more, barring deliberate destruction. The pyramid has outlasted the civilization that built it, has outlasted the religious system that gave it meaning, has outlasted the very memory of how it was built. Stands now as monument not to Pharaoh, whose name is known only because later inscriptions mentioned him, but to human capability itself, to the ability to conceive of monumental projects, to the organizational sophistication required to execute them, to the drive to create something that will outlast the creator. Other pyramids followed. The Pyramid of Khafre, Khufu's successor, appears taller because it stands on higher ground but is actually slightly smaller. The Pyramid of Menkaure is much smaller. Resources were declining. Enthusiasm for such massive projects perhaps waning. Later pyramids were smaller still, built more quickly, less carefully, and many collapsed in ancient times because their construction was compromised by corner cutting and insufficient foundation work. The age of pyramid building lasted about a century. Later pharaohs chose different burial methods: rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, hidden rather than proclaimed, secret rather than monumental. The hidden tombs fared better. Tutankhamun's tomb, found nearly intact in 1922, contained treasures that gave us a glimpse of what pyramids once held. But the hidden tombs lacked the pyramid's proclamation, lacked the assertion that king's power was so great it could command mountains built by human hands. The pyramids stand now as the last survivors of the ancient world's 7 wonders, stand in desert that has advanced and receded over millennia, stand overlooking Cairo, watching civilization continue its endless transformation. Tourists climb the courses that were never meant to be climbed, that have been worn by centuries of climbing. Scholars measure and theorize. Engineers marvel. And the pyramids wait, silent about their true purposes, revealing their dimensions and alignments but keeping their meanings private, holding still whatever mysteries they were built to hold. The tomb that held 1,000 years, that meant to hold eternity, that succeeded and failed simultaneously, succeeded in creating permanence of stone, failed in protecting the body it was built to preserve. forever standing, forever empty, forever testament to human ambition and human limitation, to the grandeur of vision and the poverty of execution, to the dream of defeating death through monument and the reality that death cannot be defeated, only remembered. The pyramid stands. The body is lost. But the monument remains massive, precise, eternal in its way, testimony that humans can create permanence even if they cannot preserve it, can build for eternity even if they cannot inhabit it, can reach for the impossible and in failing to fully achieve it, achieve something else, achieve the lasting structure, the enduring question, the monument that asks across millennia what humans thought they could accomplish and what they actually accomplished instead. The pyramid, forever standing, forever questioning, forever the monument that meant to contain eternity, but instead became eternity's witness. A thread no thicker than spider's web, produced by blind caterpillars consuming mulberry leaves, somehow became the currency that connected East and West for over 1,000 years. Not gold, though gold traveled the routes. Not spices, though spices gave other names to trade networks. But silk, lightweight, valuable, impossible to produce without knowledge, that was guarded as state secret, punishable by death. This was what gave the ancient network its name and its purpose. The Silk Road was never a road, was network of routes across some of Earth's most hostile terrain. Routes that changed with political circumstances and climate variations, and the rise and fall of cities along the way. Routes that no single merchant traveled entirely, goods passed through dozens of hands, each transaction adding value, each middleman taking percentage, until bolt of silk that cost little in China commanded fortunes in Rome. The journey from Chang'an, capital of Han Dynasty China, starting point for eastern end of trade, began relatively easily. Through civilized lands where roads existed and caravanserais provided lodging, and where bandits were controlled by effective government. But the easy portion ended quickly. Beyond China's western borders lay the Taklamakan Desert, whose name translates roughly as "go in and you won't come out." The desert was not merely barren, but actively hostile, temperatures swinging from blistering during day to freezing at night. Sandstorms that could bury caravans, lack of water for days between oases, disorientation so complete that travelers reported seeing mirages of cities and hearing phantom bells, calling them toward death in trackless wastes. Those who survived the Taklamakan faced the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where altitude made breathing difficult and cold was constant even in summer, and passes were blocked by snow for much of the year. Then across Central Asian steppes where raiders waited, where cities like Samarkand and Bukhara grew wealthy as intermediaries, where multiple empires competed for control of territory that mattered not for itself, but for what passed through it. Finally, through Persian lands to the Mediterranean, to ports where goods were loaded onto ships for Rome or Constantinople, completing journey that might take years and cost many lives. But silk was not what mattered most, though it gave the routes their name. What mattered was connection, was exchange, was the meeting of civilizations that had developed in isolation, and that, in coming into contact, transformed each other in ways both subtle and profound. Buddhism spread from India to China along these routes. The religion traveled with merchants and missionaries, translated into Chinese, adapted to Chinese philosophy and social structures, becoming something new in the process Chan Buddhism, which would later become Zen in Japan, bearing resemblance to, but also diverging significantly from its Indian origins. The transformation illustrated what happened along Silk Road. Ideas did not simply transfer but evolved, hybridized, became something that belonged fully to neither origin nor destination, but to the liminal space between. Paper-making technique moved westward from China. The knowledge reached Samarkand in the 8th century supposedly, when Chinese papermakers were captured in battle and forced to share their secrets. From Samarkand, the technique spread to Baghdad, to Cairo, to Morocco, to Spain, finally to Europe in the 12th century. Without paper's westward movement, without cheaper alternative to parchment and papyrus, the printing revolution would have been impossible. The Renaissance might have been delayed or taken different form. Literacy might have remained privilege rather than becoming possibility. Astronomical knowledge and mathematical concepts crossed in both directions. Chinese innovations in astronomy reached Islamic world. Islamic algebra and trigonometry reached China. Indian mathematics, including decimal system and concept of zero, traveled westward to be adopted by Islamic scholars and eventually transmitted to Europe, revolutionizing calculation and making modern mathematics possible. The exchange was not simple borrowing. Each culture adapted what it received to its own needs and understanding, creating new mathematics, new astronomy, new ways of thinking about quantity and space and time. Languages mingled in caravanserais, those fortified waypoints, where merchants from dozen cultures gathered for rest and resupply and exchange of goods and information. Persian served as lingua franca for much of the route, but Chinese and Turkic and Arabic, and eventually Mongol mixed together, creating pidgins and trading languages, borrowing words and phrases, demonstrating that communication was possible even without shared language, that commerce created its own linguistic innovations. Cities along the route flourished. Samarkand became cosmopolitan center, where Buddhist temples stood alongside Islamic mosques, where Zoroastrian fire temples coexisted with Christian churches, where merchants from China and India and Persia and Rome met and traded and married and created communities that transcended their origins. The city's wealth came not from production, but from position, from being nodes in network, from controlling choke points in trade, from providing services that long-distance commerce required. The cities rose when trade flourished and declined when trade routes shifted, when political instability made routes dangerous, when maritime alternatives made overland trade less necessary. But the Silk Road also carried suffering. Diseases traveled the routes alongside goods and ideas. The Black Death likely spread westward along Silk Road networks in the 1340s, originating somewhere in Central Asia, transmitted by fleas carried by rats that lived in grain stores, moving with merchant caravans, reaching Mediterranean ports where ships carried it to Europe with catastrophic results. The disease demonstrated that connection had costs, that networks that enabled exchange also enabled transmission of pathogens, that interdependence created vulnerabilities. Warfare shaped the routes constantly. Empires fought for control of key sections. The Han Dynasty extended Chinese control westward to protect trade. The Roman Empire's eastern borders were defined partly by desire to control Silk Road's western terminus. The Parthian and later Sasanian Persian empires controlled crucial middle sections, taking their percentage while providing security. Later, the Mongol Empire would unify the entire route under single political control, the Pax Mongolica, that made 13th century trade safer and more extensive than it had been for centuries. But all empires were temporary. All periods of security were interludes between chaos. The Silk Road's history was punctuated by warfare and banditry, and the constant threat that made merchants carry weapons and travel in armed caravans, and sometimes choose to abandon trade rather than risk death in pursuit of profit. The routes eventually declined. Maritime trade via Indian Ocean proved faster and safer for many goods. The Mongol Empire that had protected overland trade collapsed into successor states that competed rather than cooperated. The Ming dynasty turned inward, reducing China's engagement with Western trade. The Islamic world fragmented. European navigators found sea routes to India and China, making overland journey unnecessary. By the 16th century, the Silk Road had faded, some sections still used for regional trade, but the great age of transcontinental caravans was ended. The legacy remained in goods and technologies and ideas that had crossed continents, remained in genetic mixing. Modern DNA studies show Central Asian populations carry ancestry from East and West, testimony to centuries of population movements along trade routes. Remained in archaeological sites, abandoned caravanserais and cities half buried by sand, pottery and coins bearing witness to exchange that once flourished. Remained in modern attempts to revive the Silk Road concept. China's Belt and Road Initiative explicitly invokes the ancient network, attempting to create modern infrastructure that follows ancient routes, that connects Asia to Europe through land corridors and maritime lanes. The silk that connected empires, the thread that tied civilizations together despite distance and difference. The trade network that carried more than goods, carried ideas and religions and technologies, carried diseases and warfare, carried evidence that humans have always reached beyond immediate surroundings, have always sought to exchange and communicate and connect across impossible distances. The routes are quiet now. The caravanserais are ruins. The great trading cities have declined or transformed into different things. But the legacy of connection persists in every exchange between cultures, persists in every technology borrowed and adapted, persists in every moment when humans reach across difference to find common ground, to trade something valuable, to learn from those who are distant and different, and yet recognizably human. The Silk Road, forever connecting, forever testament to exchange, forever the network that proved humans could link across continents, could maintain connections over generations, could create systems of trade and cultural exchange that enriched all participants even as they extracted costs from many. The silk, the road, the connection that transcended distance, forever woven into history, forever linking past to present, forever testimony that isolation was never humanity's destiny. That connection, however difficult, however dangerous, however costly, was always the path forward. In Alexandria, where Mediterranean waves lapped against Egypt's northern shore, where Greek culture met African wisdom and Near Eastern learning. A building rose that attempted impossibility. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death, was not simply repository of texts, but was research institution, was university before universities existed, was gathering place for scholars from across known world who came to study manuscripts collected through purchase, copying, and occasionally confiscation. The library's ambition was total, was to gather all human knowledge under one roof, to collect every text from every culture, to translate what was written in foreign languages so Greek scholars could access it, to create universal repository where wisdom from Egypt and Persia and India and Greece and all known lands could be studied together, compared, synthesized into greater understanding. The ambition was breathtaking, was unprecedented, was testament to the cosmopolitan culture that Alexandria represented, the meeting place where different traditions encountered each other not as enemies, but as potential sources of mutual enrichment. Ships docking in Alexandria were required to surrender any scrolls they carried. The scrolls were copied sometimes by scribes working in scriptorium attached to library, sometimes by private copyists hired for the purpose. The copies were returned to the ship's owners. The originals stayed in the library. The practice was aggressive, was potentially unfair to those whose texts were confiscated, but was also effective at building collection that grew to legendary proportions. How many scrolls? The numbers vary in ancient sources, 40,000 in some accounts, 400,000 in others, 700,000 in the most extravagant claims. Modern scholars debate whether the largest numbers refer to individual scrolls or to individual works, noting that single work might occupy multiple scrolls and that library likely cataloged at work level rather than scroll level. But whatever the exact count, the collection was enormous, was unparalleled, was the greatest gathering of knowledge that ancient world achieved. The library was not merely storage, was active research institution. Scholars studied their mathematicians and astronomers and physicians and philosophers and poets and grammarians. They had access to texts unavailable elsewhere, had ability to compare different versions of same work, to trace how texts changed as they were copied and transmitted, to reconstruct more accurate versions through scholarly comparison, had opportunity to meet other scholars working on related questions, to exchange ideas, to collaborate in ways that isolation made impossible. The achievements were remarkable. Eratosthenes, head of library in 3rd century BCE, calculated Earth's circumference with astounding accuracy, using only geometry and observations of shadows at different latitudes. His calculation was within a few percent of modern measurements, achieved with tools that seem primitive compared to modern technology, but that, in hands of brilliant mathematician with access to libraries' resources, yielded precision that would not be matched for centuries. Euclid organized geometry into systematic form that would remain standard for 2,000 years. His Elements, written in Alexandria, gathered all known geometrical knowledge, organized it logically, proved each proposition rigorously from first principles. The work was not simply compilation, but was creative synthesis. Euclid saw connections that others had missed, found ways to organize knowledge that made it more accessible and more powerful. Aristarchus proposed heliocentric model of solar system, argued that Earth and other planets orbited Sun, rather than everything orbiting Earth. His model was rejected by most ancient astronomers who found geocentric system more intuitively obvious and better supported by observation. But the heliocentric idea survived in libraries' manuscripts, preserved for nearly 2 millennia, until Copernicus revived it in 16th century, eventually revolutionizing astronomy and cosmology. Callimachus created libraries cataloged the Pinaques, organizing works by author and subject, providing summaries, allowing scholars to locate texts relevant to their research. The catalog itself was massive work, 120 scrolls long, itself housed in library it cataloged. The organizational system Callimachus developed influenced later library science, provided model for how knowledge could be systematically organized and made accessible. The loss of Alexandria's library is history's great tragedy, but the loss itself is complicated. There was no single moment of destruction, no dramatic fire that consumed everything overnight. Instead, the library declined gradually through combination of factors: funding cuts, institutional neglect, political instability, religious conflict, and probably multiple fires or attacks that each destroyed portions of collection. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE during civil war with Pompey may have destroyed warehouses containing texts intended for library, but probably did not destroy library proper. Christian mob in 391 CE destroyed Serapeum, temple complex that housed part of collection, during religious conflicts between Christians and pagans. Arab conquest in 640 CE traditionally blamed for libraries' final destruction, But this probably occurred after library had already largely ceased to function as major institution. The truth is likely that library died gradually survived various catastrophes in diminished form, continued functioning with reduced resources, eventually faded into obscurity as Byzantine and early Islamic periods brought different priorities and institutional structures. What was lost cannot be fully calculated. Lost were the plays of Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus that we don't have. They wrote dozens. We have only 7 from Sophocles, 7 from Aeschylus, 18 from Euripides. Lost was Eratosthenes' precise mathematical work that we know of only through later references. Lost were countless histories and philosophies and scientific treatises that might have transformed human knowledge had they survived. Lost was Aristotle's writing on comedy. We have his Poetics on tragedy, but the section on comedy is missing, depriving us of his systematic analysis of humor and comic structure. But perhaps most significant loss was loss of the idea itself. The idea that knowledge could be universal, that all human learning could be gathered and studied systematically. That understanding had no boundaries of culture or geography or language. That wisdom from anywhere was potentially valuable and should be preserved and made accessible. The Library of Alexandria represented human knowledge at its most ambitious, most inclusive, most optimistic about reason's possibilities. The loss of Alexandria led to fragmentation, led to knowledge being dispersed across multiple centers, held in monastic libraries and private collections, controlled by religious authorities, who sometimes preserved texts and sometimes destroyed those they found heretical or dangerous. Led to dark ages, though that term is contested when access to classical learning was reduced, when literacy declined, when systematic scientific inquiry largely ceased in Western Europe, even as it continued in Byzantine and Islamic worlds. The library stands now only in imagination and fragments. The physical structure is gone, built over, repurposed, quarried for stone, disappeared into Alexandria's layered history. Scattered papyri found in Egypt sometimes bear texts that may have passed through Alexandria's collection, but direct connection cannot be proven. Archaeological hints suggest where library might have stood, but certainty is impossible. Modern Alexandria built new library Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002, attempting to revive ancient institutions' spirit if not its physical continuity. The modern library is beautiful circular structure overlooking Mediterranean, housing millions of books, serving as research center and cultural institution. But it cannot recover what was lost, cannot restore the manuscripts that burned or rotted or were deliberately destroyed, cannot recover the idea of centralized universal knowledge collection in age when information is distributed across networks rather than concentrated in single institution. Yet the dream persists in every library that attempts comprehensive collection, persists in digital databases that try to gather all human knowledge in searchable form, persists in Wikipedia and Internet Archive and countless other projects that try to preserve and make accessible what humans have learned and created, persists in recognition that knowledge is most valuable when it is shared, when it is preserved, when it is made accessible to all who seek it. The library that held all knowledge, the building that attempted the impossible, the institution that believed wisdom had no borders, forever lost, forever remembered, forever inspiring attempts to gather what can never be completely gathered, to preserve what constantly threatens to be forgotten, to create access to knowledge that transcends the barriers of language and culture and distance and time. The library lives in memory, lives in aspiration, lives in every attempt to collect and preserve and share human knowledge. The physical structure is gone. The manuscripts are lost. But the idea remains the idea that knowledge should be universal, that wisdom should be gathered, that understanding should transcend boundaries. The idea lives still, forever gathering, forever aspiring, forever testimony that humans are not content with ignorance, not satisfied with knowing only what is local and immediate, always reaching toward comprehensive understanding even when comprehension exceeds grasp. The library, forever lost, forever living, forever the dream of knowledge made accessible. Across northern China, snaking over mountains and through valleys for thousands of miles, the Great Wall rose stone by stone, generation by generation, dynasty after dynasty. Not one wall but many walls built and rebuilt over centuries, connected and extended and reinforced, attempting to create permanent boundary between settled agricultural China and nomadic pastoral peoples to the north. The wall represented more than military defense, represented the fundamental tension between two ways of life, the farmer's life bound to land and seasons, and the herder's life following animals across grasslands that knew no permanent borders. The wall's origins reached back to the Warring States period, when various Chinese kingdoms built defensive barriers against each other and against northern raiders. These early walls were modest rammed earth and wood, marking territory more than providing serious military obstacle. But Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who unified China in 221 BCE, saw possibility in connecting and extending these separate barriers, saw potential for creating unified defensive system that would protect China's northern frontier and symbolize the unity he had imposed on previously warring kingdoms. The construction consumed lives in quantities that history records imperfectly, but that tradition remembers as catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of workers, conscripted laborers, soldiers, prisoners spent years moving earth and stone in landscape that ranged from desert to mountain to steppe. The work was brutal, was dangerous. Workers fell from scaffolding, were crushed by falling stones, died from exhaustion and exposure and the simple grinding fatigue of labor that had no end, that stretched across years and decades and generations. Some bodies were buried in the wall itself, not deliberately as popular myth suggests, but through practical necessity when workers died during construction and were buried where they fell, incorporated into the structure they had died building. The wall that emerged was impressive by any measure, was roughly 5,500 miles long when measured along its main line, much longer if all branches and extensions are included. Rose to heights of 25 feet in some sections, thick enough at top for horses to ride along it, punctuated by watchtowers and garrison stations where soldiers could be stationed to watch for approaching threats. The wall followed terrain, climbed mountain ridges, descended into valleys, adapted to landscape in ways that made it both formidable barrier and astonishing feat of engineering that worked with rather than against geography. But the wall could not keep them out. Not ultimately. Not permanently. The mathematics were against it. The wall was too long to defend everywhere simultaneously. An army of hundreds of thousands would be needed to garrison every section adequately, and maintaining such force year after year was economically impossible even for wealthy empire. The defenders had to guess where attacks would come. The attackers could choose when and where to strike. The advantage lay always with the nomads who could concentrate force at single point, while defenders were spread thin along thousands of miles of barrier. The Mongols crossed it. Genghis Khan and his successors found or created breaches, sometimes through force, sometimes through bribing garrison commanders, sometimes by simply riding around the wall's ends where it terminated in mountains or deserts that seemed impassable but weren't. The Mongols established Yuan dynasty, ruling China for nearly a century before being expelled by native Chinese who founded Ming dynasty. The Manchus crossed it, coming from the northeast in 17th century. They conquered China and established Qing dynasty that would rule until 1912. The wall's military effectiveness was always limited by the simple reality that static defenses cannot absolutely prevent movement, can only make movement more difficult and costly. Yet the wall was never only military defense, was also psychological boundary marker of civilization's edge, definition of what was inside and what was outside, physical manifestation of Chinese cultural identity. The Chinese saw themselves as representatives of civilization, had writing and cities and agriculture and bureaucracy, and all the markers that defined civilized life. Beyond the wall were barbarians, nomadic peoples who lived in tents, who wrote nothing down, who had no cities, who seemed to Chinese eyes to live like animals. The wall marked the boundary between these worlds, declared that China was separate from and superior to what lay beyond, was economic regulation. The wall contained gates-controlled passages where trade could occur, where taxes could be collected, where the exchange between agricultural China and pastoral steppe could be managed and monitored. The gates were points of contact, places where different economic systems met and exchanged what each produced: Chinese silk and tea, and manufactured goods for nomadic horses and furs and livestock. The gates made possible peaceful exchange, while the wall made possible exclusion when exchange broke down into conflict. Was engineering achievement. The wall adapted to available materials and terrain, stone in mountains where stone was plentiful, brick in areas where kilns could be established, rammed earth in deserts where little else was available. The construction techniques, refined over centuries, incorporated lessons learned from earlier building efforts, created structures that have survived millennia despite lacking modern materials or methods. Some sections have crumbled. Some have been quarried for building materials by local populations. Some have simply weathered away. But much remains, testament to the skill of builders who created something meant to last forever using nothing but earth and stone and human labor. The wall stands now partly restored for tourists, partly crumbling in remote sections, partly disappeared entirely. The restored sections near Beijing are impressive, rebuilt using modern materials and methods, made safe for millions of tourists who climb the steep steps and photograph the serpentine lines stretching across ridges toward distant horizon. But the restored sections are also artificial, made too perfect, too safe, too cleaned of the accumulated decay that gives ruins their truth. The unrestored sections tell different story, tell of abandonment and entropy, of watchtowers collapsing into rubble, of walls melting back into hillsides, of the slow victory of time over permanence, of nature reclaiming what humans built. These sections are dangerous to climb, stones are loose, mortar has crumbled, sections have fallen away leaving drops that could kill. But these sections are also authentic, show what the wall actually is when stripped of restoration and tourist infrastructure. Show the reality of structure built to last forever slowly being defeated by forever. The wall has become symbol used by Chinese government to represent national unity and ancient greatness, used by historians to discuss limits of defensive thinking, used by tourists as bucket list destination and photo opportunity. The symbol has obscured the reality. The wall becomes whatever interpreter wants it to be: great achievement or great failure, symbol of civilization or symbol of isolation, testament to human capability or testament to human inability to solve problems through construction alone. But the wall itself remains mostly silent about its meanings. Remains stone and earth stretched across landscape. Remains barrier that was permeable, boundary that was crossed, defensive system that ultimately failed to defend. The nomads China tried to exclude, sometimes conquered China. The Silk Road crossed the wall. Ideas crossed it. Eventually, people crossed it so thoroughly that distinction between Chinese and non-Chinese became increasingly difficult to maintain in northern regions where populations mixed. The wall that could not keep them out. The boundary that was always permeable. The monument to impossible security. Forever standing, forever incomplete, forever testimony to human drive to create permanence in world that refuses permanence, to establish borders in world where everything flows and changes and crosses boundaries, no matter how massive those boundaries are made. The wall stands, the barrier remains, but what it guarded against passed through it anyway. The nomads came, the cultures mixed. The absolute distinction between inside and outside dissolved into gradations and compromises, and the endless complexity of human interaction that cannot be controlled through stone and mortar and the multiplication of barriers. The wall, forever standing, forever breached, forever testimony that walls cannot prevent what they are built to prevent, can only delay, can only redirect, can only make crossing more difficult without making it impossible. The lesson applies beyond ancient China. Applies to all walls, all barriers, all attempts to create absolute separation in world where absolute separation has never existed and cannot exist. The wall that could not keep them out, forever teaching, forever questioning, forever asking whether security can ever be achieved through building higher walls or whether security requires different thinking entirely. The wall stands. The teaching continues. The question remains unanswered. In 1347, ships arrived in Sicilian port of Messina carrying cargo and crew, and something else, something invisible, something deadly, something that would transform medieval Europe more profoundly than any war or political change. The Black Death, bubonic plague caused by Bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread by fleas carried by rats, though contemporaries understood nothing of bacteria or vectors or epidemiology. They understood only that death was spreading, that bodies were piling faster than they could be buried, that nothing, not prayer, not medicine, not fleeing, seemed to protect against the pestilence that moved like shadow across the land. The symptoms appeared suddenly. Swellings in lymph nodes, the buboes that gave bubonic plague its name, appearing in groin and armpits and neck, growing to size of eggs or apples, turning black with hemorrhaged blood, causing agony that no medieval remedy could ease. Fever followed. Delirium. Black spots on skin where blood vessels burst. Death came within days for most victims, within hours for some. The speed was terrifying. Someone healthy at dawn could be dead by sunset. Families were destroyed in days. Entire households disappeared. The plague moved through trade networks that had connected medieval world. The disease likely originated somewhere in Central Asia, exact location debated, but possibly in region, around Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, where archaeological evidence shows unusual mortality in late 1330s. From there, it traveled westward along Silk Road, carried by merchant caravans, transmitted through trade goods, and the rats that infested warehouses and ships. The plague reached Crimea, was supposedly catapulted into Kaffa, Genoese trading port, when Mongol besiegers used plague corpses as biological weapons. From Kaffa, ships carried plague to Constantinople, to ports across Mediterranean, to Sicily and Italy and southern France. Cities suffered worst. Dense populations meant rapid transmission. Poor sanitation meant rats thrived. Narrow streets and crowded housing meant plague could spread building by building, neighborhood by neighborhood, until entire cities became charnel houses. Florence lost perhaps 60% of its population. Venice lost similar proportion. Paris burned with plague for 2 years. London streets filled with carts collecting bodies, with criers calling, "Bring out your dead," with mass graves that could barely accommodate the numbers dying. But rural areas suffered too. Entire villages emptied. Fields went unplanted because there were no survivors to plant them. Harvests rotted because there were no survivors to gather them. The social fabric that held medieval society together unraveled as death ignored all bonds, family bonds, feudal bonds, the mutual obligations that structured life. Children died while parents survived. Parents died leaving orphans. Entire family lines disappeared. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than physical mortality. The plague seemed purposeless, seemed arbitrary. The good died alongside the wicked. Priests died while administering last rites to plague victims, their sanctity offering no protection. Nobility died in their castles despite wealth and isolation. The plague demonstrated that social hierarchy meant nothing to death, that divine favor was no protection, that the world operated according to principles humans could neither understand nor influence. Some turned to religious extremism. The flagellants appeared groups moving from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays, believing collective suffering might appease divine wrath. They sang hymns while they scourged themselves, drew crowds who watched with horror and hope, created spectacle that was both devotional practice and desperate attempt to make sense of senseless suffering. The Church eventually condemned flagellants as heretical, but the impulse behind the movement, the need to do something, to believe that human action could influence plague's spread, was understandable even if the practice was ineffective. Others turned to scapegoating. Jews were blamed for poisoning wells, for causing plague through malicious magic, for conspiracy against Christians. The accusations were nonsensical. Jews were dying of plague at same rates as Christians. Poison in wells couldn't cause plague symptoms. No evidence supported any of the claims. But scapegoating met psychological need, gave explanation for inexplicable suffering, provided target for rage and fear. Jewish communities across Europe were massacred in Strasbourg, in Mainz, in countless other cities where frightened populations needed someone to blame and chose the traditional targets of medieval prejudice. Still others turned to hedonism. If death could come tomorrow, why not pleasure today? Why accumulate wealth that you couldn't take with you? Why maintain social conventions when everyone might be dead soon? Some people abandoned restraint, indulged in excesses of food and drink and sex, spent fortunes on immediate pleasures, rejected future-oriented thinking because future seemed impossible to predict or plan for. The behavior was understandable, was response to overwhelming uncertainty, to breakdown of normal expectations, to world where prudence and planning seemed pointless. But the plague also transformed medieval world in ways that endured after mortality rates recovered. Labor became valuable when labor was scarce. Before plague, labor was abundant. Population had been growing for centuries. Wages were low. Peasants were tied to land through feudal obligations they couldn't escape. After plague, surviving peasants could demand higher wages, could negotiate better conditions, could leave feudal obligations by moving to other areas where labor was desperately needed. The economic shift weakened feudalism, strengthened merchant class, accelerated movement toward market economies, where labor had price rather than being obligation. The church's authority weakened. The plague had demonstrated limits of religious explanations. Prayers didn't prevent infection. Saints' relics offered no protection. Church's answers proved inadequate to crisis's magnitude. Many people maintained faith, but faith was shaken. The certainties that had structured medieval worldview became less certain. Questions were asked that couldn't be easily answered. The weakening of church authority created space for different thinking, for skepticism, for questioning tradition, for intellectual movements that would eventually produce Renaissance and Reformation. Art changed. Pre-plague art had been optimistic, showed heaven's glory, showed saints' triumphs, showed world as fundamentally ordered and meaningful. Post-plague art became darker, showed dance macabre with skeletons leading living to grave, showed death as great leveler cutting down pope and peasant equally, showed suffering without redemption. The shift reflected changed worldview, world where death was arbitrary, where suffering was meaningless, where traditional assurances provided insufficient comfort. Medical practice evolved. The plague exposed limitations of medieval medicine, the humoral theories, the bloodletting, the reliance on ancient authorities who knew nothing of bacterial disease. Some physicians began emphasizing observation over tradition, documenting symptoms carefully, noting what treatments seemed to help even slightly. The shift toward empiricism was gradual and incomplete, but plague created urgency that hadn't existed before. When people are dying in such numbers, when traditional methods fail so completely, experimentation becomes necessary even when church authorities discourage it. The plague returned repeatedly. 13,471,353 was worst outbreak, but not the only one. Plague recurred in waves for centuries. 13,611,362, 13,691,371, 1400, 1438, and dozens of smaller outbreaks that terrorized local populations. Each recurrence killed fewer because population had dropped so much there were fewer people to kill, because survivors had some immunity, because populations learned practices that somewhat reduced transmission. But plague remained endemic in Europe until 18th century, remained threat that could erupt suddenly and kill thousands before disappearing again. The plague that emptied cities, the death that killed perhaps one-third of Europe's population, the disease that transformed medieval world more profoundly than any war or revolution, forever remembered, forever feared, forever testimony to human vulnerability, to the power of invisible forces humans couldn't understand or control, to the fragility of civilization that seemed permanent until disease demonstrated otherwise. The plague changed everything. Changed economy and society and culture and religion. Changed how people thought about death and life and divine providence. Changed the trajectory of European history in ways that shaped modern world. The Black Death was catastrophe, was tragedy measured in millions of lives lost, but was also transformation that created space, demographic and economic and intellectual, for changes that might not have occurred otherwise. The plague emptied cities, but also opened possibilities, cleared space where Renaissance could emerge, created conditions where feudalism could weaken and new economic forms develop, made possible through suffering what might not have been possible through prosperity. The plague, forever remembered in art and literature and historical memory, forever the shadow hanging over late medieval period, forever the reminder that humans are vulnerable, that death can come suddenly, that the world can transform overnight in ways no one predicts or controls. The empty cities, the mass graves, the suffering that had no meaning except what survivors imposed upon it, forever dark, forever transformative, forever testimony to the thin line between civilization and catastrophe. A magnetized needle floating in water, pointing always toward Earth's magnetic north. Simple technology, known in China for centuries before Europeans adopted it, known to Arab traders who used it for navigation across Indian Ocean, but in hands of Portuguese and Spanish navigators in the 1400s, the compass became key that unlocked what Europeans called the Age of Discovery. Though for those discovered, it was age of conquest, of disease, of transformation both welcomed and resisted. The compass allowed oceanic navigation beyond sight of land. Before compass, sailors hugged coasts, used landmarks, limited voyages to waters they knew. The compass allowed departure from shore, allowed maintenance of course through weeks at sea, allowed return to places previously visited not by stumbling upon them again, but by navigating to them deliberately through knowledge of direction and distance. Combined with astrolabe and quadrant for measuring latitude, combined with improved ship designs, the caravel with its lateen sails that could sail closer to wind, and combined with better understanding of winds and currents, the compass made possible voyages that previous generations would have considered suicidal. Columbus crossed Atlantic in 1492, though he wasn't first European to reach Americas, as Vikings had established settlements in Newfoundland centuries earlier. But Columbus's voyage initiated sustained contact rather than brief encounter that was forgotten. He sailed west seeking India, found Caribbean islands, returned convinced he had reached Asian coast, died never knowing he had encountered continents unknown to European geography. His error didn't matter. What mattered was that he demonstrated Atlantic could be crossed, that lands existed beyond it, that wealth might be gained through exploration. Vasco da Gama rounded Africa to reach India in 1498, achieving what Portuguese had attempted for decades, opening direct sea route between Europe and Asian spice markets, breaking Venetian and Ottoman control of overland spice trade. The voyage was brutal. Da Gama lost half his crew to scurvy and other diseases, demonstrated that oceanic voyages carried terrible costs in human life. But the profits justified the costs. Spices that had been expensive rarities became accessible commodities. Portuguese established trading posts across Indian Ocean. The balance of trade shifted. Magellan's expedition circumnavigated globe in 15,191,522, though Magellan himself died in Philippines, killed in battle with indigenous peoples. His surviving crew completed the journey, proving Earth was round through direct experience rather than through theory, demonstrating that all oceans connected, opening Pacific to European navigation. The voyage took 3 years. Started with 5 ships and 270 men. Returned with 1 ship and 18 survivors. The mortality rate was catastrophic, but the achievement was undeniable. The compass enabled these voyages, but the consequences extended far beyond exploration. The world that had been separated by oceans became connected by trade routes and colonial relationships. The Columbian Exchange began named for Columbus, though the exchange involved all European contact with Americas. Old World crops and animals moved to America's wheat and rice and cattle and horses and pigs. New World crops moved to Old World potatoes and maize and tomatoes and tobacco. The exchanges transformed agriculture on both sides of Atlantic, enabled population growth, changed diets and economies. But the compass that found new worlds also destroyed old worlds. Native American populations were decimated by European diseases, smallpox and measles and influenza, against which they had no immunity. The demographic catastrophe was staggering. Perhaps 90% of indigenous population died within century of contact. Not from warfare primarily, though warfare killed many, but from disease. The epidemic spread faster than Europeans themselves, carried by indigenous traders and travelers, reaching populations that had never seen Europeans, but that died from diseases Europeans brought. Civilizations collapsed. The Aztec Empire fell to Cortés's small force in 1521, but fell primarily because smallpox epidemic had killed much of population and destabilized social order. The Inca Empire fell to Pizarro's even smaller force in 1530s, again aided by disease that had spread from Caribbean and devastated Incan population before Spaniards arrived. Countless smaller societies were absorbed or destroyed, languages disappeared. Cultural knowledge was lost. Societies that had flourished for centuries vanished within decades of European contact. The compass enabled slave trade. The triangular trade that brought manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, exchanged them for enslaved Africans, transported enslaved people to Americas in horrific Middle Passage voyages, brought raw materials, sugar and tobacco, and cotton back to Europe. The trade lasted centuries. Transported perhaps 12 million Africans across Atlantic, with mortality so high that perhaps 15% died during voyage, with uncountable deaths in Africa during wars and raids that captured people for enslavement. The slave trade created wealth for European and American merchants and plantation owners, created demographic catastrophe in Africa, created societies in Americas built on forced labor and racial hierarchy that would persist long after slavery ended. The compass enabled colonialism. European powers claimed territories across Americas, across Africa, eventually across Asia and Pacific, established colonies that extracted resources and wealth, that displaced indigenous populations, that created global economic system where colonies produced raw materials for European factories and bought European manufactured goods. The colonial relationships would dominate global politics for centuries, creating inequalities that persist, creating grievances that continue shaping international relations. The navigation technologies themselves were morally neutral, were simply tools. The compass pointed north regardless of who used it or for what purpose. The astrolabe measured latitude whether used for peaceful trade or for voyages of conquest. The ships carried explorers and merchants and missionaries and conquerors without caring which cargo they transported. But tools are never neutral in their effects. The uses to which they were put, the purposes they served, the outcomes they enabled, these require acknowledgement and judgment. The compass found new worlds, but at cost measured in millions of lives. Found connection, but through violence. Found global trade, but through exploitation. The technology itself was elegant, simple magnetized needle, principle known for centuries, application that required no advanced physics or complicated engineering. But elegance of technology says nothing about morality of application. The compass enabled exploration that enriched human knowledge of Earth's geography, also enabled conquest that destroyed civilizations and enslaved millions. The age of discovery was simultaneously age of catastrophe, was opening of global connections and closing of indigenous independence, was expansion of European power and collapse of non-European societies, was triumph of navigation technology and tragedy of its consequences. The complexity cannot be resolved into simple narrative, cannot make Europeans entirely villains or heroes, cannot make indigenous peoples entirely victims or actors, cannot separate the genuine achievements of exploration from the genuine catastrophes of conquest. The compass pointed north. The ships sailed. The worlds that had been separate came into contact, and from that contact came transformation, sometimes creative, sometimes destructive, often both simultaneously. The compass that found new worlds, the needle that pointed toward empire, the tool that connected continents, forever revolutionary, forever destructive, forever both, forever testimony that human capability to create new technologies exceeds human wisdom in using those technologies well. Forever the navigation device that found what was already there but called it discovery. Forever the tool that connected but also conquered, the compass. Forever pointing, forever guiding, forever enabling voyages whose consequences exceeded any navigator's imagination. In Mainz, Germany, around 1440, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg created something that would change human communication more profoundly than any invention since writing itself. The printing press with movable type. Not the first printing. China and Korea had block printing and movable type earlier, had been printing books for centuries before Gutenberg. But Gutenberg's innovation, metal movable type that was durable and precise, oil-based ink that adhered well to metal, wine press, adapted for printing, created system that was economical enough, durable enough, and capable of producing books in quantities that made printed materials accessible rather than rare. Before Gutenberg, books were copied by hand, were expensive, were rare, were accessible only to wealthy, to clergy, to institutions with resources to maintain scriptorium, where scribes spent lifetimes copying texts letter by letter. A monastery might own 50 books and consider itself well equipped. A university library might hold a few hundred volumes. The scarcity meant knowledge was controlled by those who could afford books, by church that decided which texts were worth copying, by authorities who could prevent copying of texts they found dangerous. The printing press changed everything within decades. By 1500, just 50 years after Gutenberg's innovation, European printers had produced perhaps 20 million books. The number is staggering, represents more books than all scribes in Europe had produced in previous 1,000 years. The explosion of availability transformed literacy from rare skill into increasingly common one, transformed books from precious objects into relatively affordable commodities, transformed access to knowledge from privilege into possibility. The Bible was first and most important printed book. Gutenberg's 42-line Bible, printed between 1452 and 1455, was technical masterpiece and commercial risk, required massive investment in equipment and materials, required years of work to design and cast type, to experiment with inks and papers, to develop printing techniques that would produce acceptable quality. The result was beautiful, resembled manuscripts closely enough that early owners sometimes had printed pages illuminated by hand to make them look more like traditional books. But the significance wasn't beauty, was replicability, was ability to produce multiple copies identically, to make Bible available beyond hand-copied versions that required months to produce. The press democratized Scripture, made Bible no longer exclusively controlled by church hierarchy, made possible vernacular translations, Luther's German Bible, Tyndale's English translation, versions in French and Dutch, and eventually dozens of languages. The translations themselves were revolutionary, challenged churches' monopoly on scriptural interpretation, allowed individuals to read and interpret Scripture themselves, created theological basis for Protestant Reformation that would fragment Western Christianity and transform European politics and society. Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation would have been impossible without printing press. His 95 Theses posted in Wittenberg in 1517 were printed and distributed throughout Germany within months. His translation of New Testament into German sold thousands of copies. His sermons and tracts and theological arguments circulated widely, creating movement that couldn't be suppressed because suppressing required destroying books that were already distributed too widely to all be found and burned. The press gave Reformation speed and reach that previous heresies had lacked, made theological debate public rather than confined to clergy, made possible the transformation of Christianity that shaped modern world. Classical texts were preserved and distributed. Greek and Roman authors Aristotle and Plato and Cicero and Virgil were printed in editions that Renaissance scholars could study. The availability created Renaissance humanism, the recovery of classical learning, the emphasis on reading original sources rather than medieval commentaries, the revival of interest in ancient philosophy and literature. Without printing, Renaissance might have been confined to small circles of wealthy patrons and their scribes. With printing, Renaissance ideas spread across Europe, influenced generations of scholars and artists and thinkers. Scientific knowledge spread rapidly. New discoveries could be published and read across Europe within months, rather than remaining confined to private correspondence or to manuscripts that few people saw. Copernicus's heliocentric theory was printed and distributed. Vesalius's anatomical studies were printed with detailed illustrations. Galileo's observations of Jupiter's moons were printed. The press made possible the scientific revolution, made possible the rapid exchange of ideas, the building upon others' work, the formation of scientific community that transcended geographic boundaries. The press created reading public, created demand for books that publishers competed to meet, created market for different kinds of texts, not just religious and classical, but also popular literature, romances, how-to manuals, news pamphlets, almanacs, ballads. Created idea that reading was activity available to anyone who learned how, not restricted to elite. The democratization of reading created democratization of knowledge, created populations that demanded education, that saw literacy as valuable skill worth acquiring. But the machine that multiplied words also multiplied problems. Propaganda became possible on new scale. Governments and churches and political factions could print thousands of pamphlets spreading their messages, their versions of truth, their distortions and lies. The press amplified good information and bad information equally, made possible both enlightenment and manipulation, both truth and falsehood, both knowledge and confusion. The printing press was a tool that increased communication without guaranteeing that communication was truthful or beneficial. Censorship became necessary. Authorities recognized that ideas spread through print were harder to control than ideas spread through speech or manuscript. Catholic Church created Index of Forbidden Books. Protestant authorities banned Catholic texts. Secular governments restricted printing of seditious materials. But censorship was difficult to enforce. Books could be printed in one jurisdiction and smuggled into another. Printers could work secretly. Banned books circulated despite prohibitions. The press created problem that authorities struggled for centuries to solve: how to maintain control of information in a world where information could be multiplied and distributed faster than control mechanisms could operate. The press democratized knowledge, but also created inequality. Those who could read benefited from printed books. Those who couldn't read remained excluded. Literacy became dividing line, separated those who could access knowledge from those who couldn't, created pressure for educational expansion, created recognition that universal literacy was prerequisite for full participation in society. The pressure would take centuries to fulfill. Universal literacy remained a distant goal even in most developed societies until 19th and 20th centuries. But the press created the goal, created recognition that knowledge should be accessible, that education should be available, that literacy was right rather than privilege. The machine that multiplied words multiplied human capability for both enlightenment and manipulation, both understanding and confusion, both cooperation and conflict. The press enabled reformation and religious wars, enabled science and pseudoscience, enabled democracy and totalitarian propaganda. The technology itself was neutral. The press printed what it was fed, reproducing accurately without judging content. But neutrality of technology doesn't create neutrality of outcomes. The uses mattered. The choices about what to print and what to suppress, what to distribute and what to ban, what to promote and what to discourage, these choices shaped how printing press transformed society. The machine stands now in museums, heavy and mechanical and primitive-looking compared to digital technologies. But the revolution it started continues. Every book printed, every newspaper distributed, every document reproduced traces ancestry to Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz. Every attempt to democratize knowledge, to make information accessible, to spread learning beyond elite circles builds on foundation that printing press created. The machine that multiplied words, the press that democratized knowledge, the invention that made information accessible, forever revolutionary, forever enabling, forever testimony that communication technologies transform societies, that what begins as technical innovation becomes social revolution, that the multiplication of words creates multiplication of possibilities for good and for ill, for enlightenment and manipulation, for building understanding and for spreading confusion. The press runs still in spirit if not in mechanism, runs in every technology that multiplies and distributes information, runs in recognition that knowledge should be accessible, that ideas should be shared, that wisdom grows through exchange rather than through hoarding. The machine, forever printing, forever multiplying, forever testimony that words, once freed from scarcity, create world where knowledge is possibility rather than privilege, where ideas can spread faster than authorities can control them, where information for better and worse belongs to all who seek it. Steam, water heated beyond boiling, trapped under pressure, channeled through mechanical systems to produce motion. The principle was ancient hero of Alexandria had created steam-powered toys in 1st century CE, had demonstrated that heat could create movement, had shown possibility without realizing application. But possibility remained curiosity for 17 centuries, remained philosophical demonstration rather than practical tool, remained locked in the space between what could be imagined and what could be built, between theory and the manufacturing precision that theory required. In 18th century Britain, the possibility became necessity. The coal mines were flooding. As miners dug deeper seeking fuel that powered the growing industrial economy, they encountered groundwater seeping into shafts, accumulating faster than human or horse-powered pumps could remove it. The flooding threatened to close the deepest mines, threatened to limit coal production at moment when coal was becoming essential. The problem demanded solution, demanded power source that could work continuously, that could pump water from depths beyond what muscle could achieve, that could operate underground where horses couldn't easily work. Thomas Newcomen created the first practical steam engine in 1712 massive machine that used steam to create vacuum that pulled piston downward, that converted heat into mechanical work, that could pump water from mines continuously without exhaustion or complaint. The engine was inefficient, consumed enormous quantities of coal to produce relatively little work. But efficiency mattered less than capability. The engine could do what nothing else could do, could keep mines operational, could enable deeper mining that produced more coal, that fueled more engines in feedback loop, that accelerated industrial development. James Watt's improvements in 1760s and 1780s made steam engines efficient enough for widespread industrial use. Watt added separate condenser that eliminated need to cool cylinder every cycle, added rotary motion that allowed engines to drive machinery rather than just pumping water, added governors and other control systems that made engines self-regulating and safer. The improvements were technical, but their consequences were revolutionary. Made steam engines economical for applications beyond coal mining. Made possible the factory system, the transportation revolution, the industrial revolution that would transform civilization more rapidly than any previous change. The transformation was not sudden, was gradual shift over decades. Started in Britain where coal was abundant and capital was available, and legal system protected inventors and investors. Spread to Belgium and France and Germany, and eventually globally. Was shift from muscle power, human and animal, and from water power that depended on flowing rivers and seasonal variations, to mechanical power that didn't depend on local geography or on strength or on weather. Was liberation from biological limitations. Was harnessing of fire's energy not just for warmth and cooking, but for continuous mechanical work. The shift enabled factory system. Before steam power, manufacturing meant craftspeople working in homes or small workshops, making goods individually or in small quantities. Factories concentrated workers hundreds or thousands in single building, operating machinery powered by central steam engine, producing goods in quantities that craft production could never match. Textiles were first industry to mechanize spinning machines and power looms that could produce cloth faster and cheaper than hand spinners and weavers. But mechanization spread to metalworking and pottery, and dozens of other industries that discovered that machines could replace skilled labor with unskilled workers operating equipment. The shift enabled urbanization. Factories needed workers. Workers moved from farms to cities seeking employment. Cities grew faster than infrastructure could accommodate. Housing was built hastily and poorly. Sanitation lagged behind population growth. Clean water and waste disposal became crises. Manchester and Birmingham and other British industrial cities exploded in size, populations doubling and tripling within decades, creating urban landscapes dominated by factory smokestacks and worker tenements, creating living conditions that horrified observers and created social problems that demanded response. The shift enabled transportation revolution. Steamships weren't dependent on winds, could maintain schedules rather than being delayed by calms or contrary winds, could travel upstream on rivers where sailing ships couldn't go. Railways used steam locomotives to move freight and passengers faster and cheaper than horse-drawn transport, could cross terrain where canals couldn't be built, could operate year-round where rivers froze in winter. The transportation revolution shrank distances, made possible national markets where previously markets had been regional, made possible specialization where previously production had to be local, made possible the concentration of industry in areas with coal, rather than requiring industry to locate where customers were. But the engine that powered progress also created suffering. Factory working conditions were brutal days of 12 or 14 hours, 6 days per week, in buildings that were dangerous and unhealthy. Machinery lacked safety guards. Workers lost fingers and hands and arms to equipment that didn't stop when flesh was caught. Children worked in factories small enough to crawl under machines to retrieve dropped materials, cheap enough that employers preferred them to adults, vulnerable enough that they couldn't resist conditions that adults might protest. The early factories were places of exploitation, places where profit depended on extracting maximum labor at minimum cost, places where human cost of industrialization was measured in broken bodies and stunted lives. Urban conditions were worse than rural poverty that many workers had left. Tenements were overcrowded, entire families living in single rooms, multiple families sharing buildings that lacked running water or adequate sanitation. Disease spread rapidly through crowded slums. Cholera and typhoid and tuberculosis killed thousands. Air was thick with coal smoke from factories and from heating fires, creating smog that blackened buildings and sickened residents. Rivers became sewers. Factories dumped waste directly into water that downstream populations drank. The human cost was staggering, but was accepted as price of progress, as temporary suffering that would eventually be ameliorated by wealth that industrialization created. Environmental damage was unprecedented. Coal burning produced smoke that polluted air across industrial regions. Forests were cut down for timber. for fuel, for clearing land for agriculture that fed industrial populations. Landscapes were transformed, hillsides stripped of vegetation by mining, rivers altered by mill dams, countryside covered by factory towns that had not existed a generation earlier. The scale of human impact on environment increased dramatically with industrial power. Suddenly humans could reshape landscapes, could consume resources, could produce waste in quantities that nature struggled to absorb. The steam engine enabled capitalism's triumph, enabled accumulation of wealth on scale that created new ruling class industrialists rather than aristocrats, money rather than land as source of power. The factory owners became wealthy beyond what craft producers had ever achieved. The concentration of wealth created inequality starker than feudalism had known. Wealthy industrialists lived in mansions while their workers lived in slums. The gap between rich and poor widening to chasm that threatened social stability. But the steam engine also enabled labor movements. Workers organizing to demand better conditions, forming unions despite legal prohibition, striking despite poverty that made striking dangerous, demanding share of prosperity they were creating. The Luddites broke machines, believing technology was enemy. But broader labor movement recognized that technology itself wasn't problem, was who controlled technology and who benefited from productivity increases. The movements demanded shorter hours, better pay, safer conditions, and eventually legal recognition of workers' right to organize and negotiate collectively. The Industrial Revolution transformed material conditions of human life more rapidly than any previous change. Transformed what was possible. Goods that had been luxuries became commonplace. Travel that had been rare became routine. Communication that had been slow became rapid. Transformed what people expected. Economic growth became assumed rather than occasional. Technological progress became expected rather than surprising. Material improvement became goal that societies pursued systematically. But the revolution also created problems that persist. Created fossil fuel dependence that now threatens climate stability. Created industrial systems that produce waste faster than Earth can absorb. Created economic inequalities that no amount of growth has eliminated. Created environmental degradation that continues accelerating. The steam engines, descendants, internal combustion engines and turbines, and all the machinery that powers modern civilization continue transforming world while consuming resources and producing pollution at scales that threaten sustainability. The engine that powered progress, the steam that drove revolution, the machine that changed everything, forever running in spirit if not in original form, forever transforming, forever testimony to human capability to reshape world through technology and to human failure to anticipate or address the costs of that reshaping. The progress was real. The suffering was real. Both were consequences of same technological revolution, same harnessing of steam power, same transformation from muscle-powered world to machine-powered world. The steam rises still. The engines run different engines using different fuels but serving same purpose, converting energy into work, amplifying human capability, enabling civilization that couldn't exist without mechanical power. The legacy is complex, is achievement and catastrophe, is liberation from biological limitations and creation of environmental crisis, is wealth and poverty, is progress and suffering, all bound together in the industrial transformation that steam engine initiated. The engine, forever running, forever transforming, forever powerful, forever costly, forever the boundary between pre-industrial past and industrial present, between world limited by muscle and world empowered by machinery, between old certainties and new possibilities that include both triumph and tragedy. The steam, the power, the progress, forever rising, forever driving, forever the engine that changed everything while solving nothing permanently, that created new problems while solving old ones, that demonstrated that human power to transform exceeds human wisdom to transform well. In France in summer of 1789, in heat and hunger and hope that had accumulated through decades of inequality and hardship, the old order collapsed, not gradually, not through negotiated reform, but through violent uprising that would inspire and terrify generations, that would demonstrate what revolution could achieve and what revolution could destroy, that would promise universal liberation while delivering universal terror, that would become template and warning for every revolution that followed. The grievances were specific. Tax system that exempted nobility and clergy while burdening peasants and urban workers. Food shortages that made bread unaffordable while aristocrats feasted. Royal absolutism that denied political voice to all but tiny elite. Financial crisis that threatened bankruptcy while king and court continued extravagant spending. The grievances were real, were legitimate, were causes that might have been addressed through reform. But reform requires rulers willing to reform. And Louis XVI, well-meaning but weak, could not manage the competing demands of aristocracy, defending privileges, and common people demanding relief. The revolution began almost accidentally. The Estates General medieval representative body that hadn't met in 175 years was convened to address financial crisis. The three estates clergy, nobility, commoners met separately as tradition required. But the third estate, representing 95% of population, but having only one-third of votes, demanded that all estates meet together and vote by head rather than by order. When refused, they declared themselves National Assembly. When locked out of Meeting Hall, they gathered in Tennis Court and swore not to disband until France had constitution. The Tennis Court oath was challenge to royal authority, was assertion that sovereignty belonged to people rather than to king. The Bastille fell on July 14, 1789. The medieval fortress that had become prison and symbol of royal tyranny was stormed by Parisian crowds seeking weapons stored there. The garrison surrendered. The governor was killed, his head paraded through streets on pike in first of countless such displays. The fall was mostly symbolic. The prison held only 7 inmates. The weapons proved fewer than expected. But the symbolism mattered, demonstrated that royal power could be challenged, demonstrated that popular uprising could succeed, demonstrated that revolution had begun whether king acknowledged it or not. The promises came quickly. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the revolutionary slogan that promised transformation of human relationships, promised society organized according to justice rather than according to inherited privilege. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed universal rights: liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. The Declaration drew on Enlightenment philosophy, Rousseau and Voltaire, and the belief that reason could organize society better than tradition, that natural rights existed independent of government, that legitimate authority required consent of governed. The promise was intoxicating, was inspiring, spread across Europe, carried by revolutionary armies and by ideas that traveled even faster than armies. The promise said that hierarchy was not natural, that nobility was not born but made, that peasants were not inherently inferior to aristocrats, that government should serve people rather than people serving government. The promise said that society could be remade according to rational principles, that injustice could be eliminated, that equality was achievable if only the courage existed to sweep away institutions that maintained inequality. But the revolution also devoured its children. The moderates who began revolution, constitutional monarchists who wanted limited reforms, who wanted Britain-style system with king and parliament, were displaced by radicals. The Girondins moderate Republicans were displaced by Jacobins. The Jacobins were displaced by Robespierrists, who made ideology more important than humanity, who saw enemies everywhere, who sent thousands to guillotine in attempt to protect revolution from real and imagined threats. The Reign of Terror consumed 1793 and 1794. Perhaps 40,000 executions, aristocrats and clergy, but also revolutionaries who were insufficiently revolutionary, who were suspected of counter-evolutionary sentiment, who were denounced by neighbors settling personal scores. Marie Antoinette was guillotined. King Louis XVI had been guillotined earlier. But most victims were not nobility, were ordinary people caught in machinery of revolutionary justice that operated on suspicion rather than evidence, that valued ideological purity over mercy, that created system where accusation was nearly impossible to defend against. Robespierre himself eventually fell, was guillotined in July 1794, by coalition of revolutionaries who feared they would be next. His death ended terror but demonstrated that revolution had no stopping point, that each stage demanded further radicalization, that moderate revolution was oxymoron. The revolution that had promised liberty had created tyranny, had promised equality but delivered hierarchy of revolutionary virtue, had promised fraternity but produced civil war and factional violence. The revolution's contradictions were visible from beginning. Promised equality while maintaining slavery in colonies, the Caribbean possessions, where sugar plantations depended on enslaved labor. When enslaved people in Haiti heard revolutionary rhetoric and applied it to themselves, when they rose up demanding freedom that revolution proclaimed, the French response was to send armies to suppress them. The hypocrisy was glaring. The revolution proclaimed universal rights but meant universal white male rights. Women were excluded. Enslaved people were excluded. The universalism had limits that made mockery of its claims. Napoleon emerged from revolutionary chaos in 1799, bringing order through military coup, establishing himself first as consul, then as emperor, creating system that preserved some revolutionary reforms: legal equality, meritocracy, religious toleration, while abandoning political liberty. The Napoleonic Code codified legal reforms, spread across Europe as Napoleon's armies conquered territories from Spain to Poland, created modern legal framework that persists in many countries, but spread through conquest rather than through willing adoption, imposed by military force rather than chosen freely. The Napoleonic Wars rearranged Europe, destroyed Holy Roman Empire that had existed since 800s, created new states and destroyed old ones, spread nationalist ideas that would dominate 19th century, the idea that nations were natural political units, that people with shared language and culture deserved self-determination, that loyalty to nation should transcend loyalty to dynasty or to empire. The ideas survived Napoleon's defeat, survived the Congress of Vienna's attempt to restore old order, created revolutionary movements throughout 19th century. The revolution's legacy was therefore complex. Inspired liberation movements worldwide in Latin America, where colonies won independence, in Europe, where 1848 revolutions challenged monarchies, in all territories where oppressed populations heard revolutionary promise and tried to claim it, but also inspired reactions against revolution, conservative movements that saw revolution as dangerous, that preferred order to liberty, that defended traditional hierarchies against revolutionary leveling. The counter-revolutions were as violent as revolutions, perhaps more violent, because they had greater resources and faced less restraint, created modern political categories, left and right terms that originated in French National Assembly, where revolutionaries sat on left and traditionalists sat on right, became way of organizing political thought. Progressive and conservative became identities defined through relationship to revolutionary change. The categories persist, shape political discourse, organize parties and movements, structure debates about how societies should be organized, created modern human rights discourse. The Declaration of Rights was followed by countless other declarations: American Bill of Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, regional human rights charters. All trace ancestry to French Revolution's assertion that rights were universal, that government should protect rather than violate them, that constitutions should enumerate and guarantee fundamental freedoms. The discourse has expanded beyond French Revolution's limited vision, now includes women's rights, children's rights, rights of ethnic and sexual minorities. But the foundation was revolutionary assertion that rights existed independent of government grant. But the revolution also demonstrated dangers, demonstrated that revolutionary violence is easy to start but hard to control, that ideological purity becomes excuse for terror, that promises of universal liberation can produce particular oppression, that sweeping away old order doesn't guarantee new order will be better, that revolutions eat their children, that moderates cannot control radicals, that once violence begins it escalates beyond anyone's control. The revolution that promised everything delivered contradictions, delivered liberation and terror, delivered equality before law and social chaos, delivered end of aristocratic privilege and rise of Napoleonic empire, delivered inspiration for future liberation movements and warning about revolution's dangers. The complexity cannot be simplified, cannot make French Revolution simply good or simply bad, was both, was achievement and catastrophe, was necessary challenge to intolerable inequality and was unnecessary descent into violence, was promise that has never been fully fulfilled and was warning that has never been fully heeded. The promise remains. Liberty, equality, fraternity still proclaimed, still pursued, still inspiring those who suffer under oppression. The revolution demonstrated that old orders can be overthrown, that hierarchies that seem eternal can be dismantled, that societies can be reorganized according to principles of justice. But the revolution also demonstrated that destroying is easier than building, that violence unleashed is hard to contain, that good intentions guarantee nothing about outcomes. The revolution that promised everything, the transformation that attempted the impossible, the uprising that changed Europe and inspired world. Forever remembered as moment of liberation and moment of terror. Forever studied as example of what revolution can achieve and what revolution can destroy. Forever inspiring and forever warning. Forever the promise that equality is possible and forever the demonstration that achieving equality requires more than proclamation, requires sustained work and constant vigilance and willingness to resist the temptation toward violence that revolution makes seductive. The revolution, forever promising, forever warning, forever testimony that humans can remake society but cannot control all consequences of remaking. Forever the boundary between ancient regime and modern world, between inherited privilege and claimed equality, between submission and assertion of rights. The revolution continues in every movement for justice, in every challenge to hierarchy, in every assertion that society can be better than it is. The promise persists. The warning persists. Both are real. Both matter. Both are French Revolution's legacy. Conclusion, and so we arrive at evening's end. Have traveled through millennia from first flames that refused to die to revolutions that promised everything. Have witnessed stones that remembered sky and rivers that built first cities. Have stood before tombs that meant to hold eternity and walls that could not keep out what they were built to exclude. have survived plagues that emptied cities and used compasses that found new worlds, have seen libraries that tried to hold all knowledge and machines that multiplied words, have felt engines that powered progress and revolutions that remade societies. The journey shows us something, shows us that human history is not simple story of progress, is not march from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from barbarism toward civilization, is instead complicated movement forward and backward, achieving and destroying, building and tearing down, learning and forgetting. Every achievement carries cost. Every transformation creates new problems while solving old ones. Every revolution promises liberation while producing new forms of oppression. The first fire warmed us but also allowed us to burn. The stone circles captured celestial patterns, but we cannot reconstruct what they meant to builders. The cities gave us civilization, but also gave us slavery and warfare. The pyramids achieved immortality of structure, but failed immortality of body. The Silk Road connected empires but also spread diseases. The library gathered knowledge, but the knowledge was lost. The wall protected but also isolated. The plague killed millions but also transformed society. The compass found worlds but also destroyed them. The printing press democratized knowledge but also enabled propaganda. The steam engine powered progress but also created environmental catastrophe. The revolution promised equality but delivered terror. This is not pessimism, is realism, is recognition that human capability exceeds human wisdom, that we can create technologies and societies and transformations whose consequences we cannot predict or control, that good intentions guarantee nothing about outcomes, that every solution creates new problems, that history moves not toward inevitable triumph, but through endless complexity where every answer raises new questions. But this is also not despair, because the journey also shows human resilience, shows that we endure catastrophes and rebuild, shows that we learn however slowly from mistakes, shows that we continue reaching toward understanding even when understanding exceeds grasp, shows that fire kept burning through millennia because people tended it, shows that stones were raised to mark patterns because people believed patterns mattered, shows that cities were built despite their problems because people needed what cities offered, shows that knowledge was gathered even when gathering seemed impossible, shows that revolutions were attempted even when revolutions were dangerous. We are inheritors of all these transformations, carry them in our bodies adapted to cooked food and firelit nights, carry them in our minds shaped by cities and writing and books and machines, Carry them in our societies organized according to principles that revolution proclaimed, and that struggle continues trying to fulfill. Carry them in our technologies that descend from first tools and first wheels and first engines. Carry them in our questions about who we are and where we came from and where we are going. The evening has deepened. The journey through time has brought us to present moment, to this night, this breath, this quiet space between waking and sleep. The history we have traveled through was never simply past, was always prologue, was always foundation upon which present moment rests. Understanding history doesn't tell us what future will be. But understanding history tells us what humans are capable of, the achievements and the failures, the wisdom and the foolishness, the creating and the destroying. And perhaps that understanding is enough. Perhaps knowing that fire was kept burning through countless generations can inspire us to tend our own fires. Perhaps knowing that stones were raised to capture patterns can inspire us to seek patterns in our own time. Perhaps knowing that cities were built despite their problems can inspire us to address cities' problems rather than abandoning urban life. Perhaps knowing that knowledge was gathered despite obstacles can inspire us to continue gathering and preserving and sharing what we learn. The stars turn overhead as they turned for first humans who looked upward and saw patterns. The rivers flow as they flowed when first cities rose beside them. The earth remains as it has always been, patient with human projects, absorbing what we build, reclaiming what we abandon, continuing through all our transformations. We are brief. Our civilizations are brief. But what we create, the knowledge and the stories and the understanding, can persist beyond us if we choose to preserve it and pass it forward. So rest now. Let the journey through time settle into sleep's embrace. Let the weight of history become something lighter, not burden but connection, not obligation but inheritance, not demand but possibility. The past is finished. The future is unknown. But this moment remains, this breath, this stillness, this space where history and sleep and dream all meet. The fire burns still. The stones stand. The words multiply. The engine runs. The promise continues. And we, brief inheritors of long history, we carry it forward into whatever comes next. Rest now. Sleep well. And when morning comes, when the new day begins, remember that you are part of this ancient journey, this endless becoming, this human story that has no ending because every ending is also beginning. The evening deepens into night. The journey ends in sleep. And in sleep, perhaps, the ancestors whisper, still telling stories around fires that never die, raising stones that remember sky, building cities that reach toward impossible heights, gathering knowledge that illuminates darkness, attempting revolutions that promise everything. Sleep now. The history continues. The story never ends. And you are part of it, forever connected, forever carrying forward what was given, forever tending the fire that must not die. Rest, sleep. Dream of all that was and all that might yet be. The journey is complete. The evening has become night, and in the silence history whispers still, forever.